I am 83 years old. I live alone in a sterile one-bedroom apartment on the forgotten edge of the city. The walls are a sickly, fading shade of beige. The carpet is worn thin, and my only window looks out over the cracked concrete of a parking garage. I sit in a cheap vinyl recliner all day, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a cheap wall clock. I am waiting for the end. I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not here to impart some gentle grandfatherly wisdom. I am not going to offer you a comforting parable or tell you that everything happens for a reason or that God has a grand design. I am going to tell you the ugly, unvarnished truth about what humans actually are, and the sickening truth about what I became by pretending I could save them. For 40 long, agonizing years, I was a Catholic priest. For 40 years, I sat inside a wooden box, no bigger than a broom closet, and acted as a silent, locked vault for the absolute worst filth the human race has to offer. You think you know what a confession booth is. You have seen it romanticized in movies and television, a quiet, holy sanctuary where burdened, weeping souls come to seek divine mercy and find lasting peace. That is a lie. That is a fabricated fairy tale we sell to the masses to keep the pews full and the collection plates heavy. The physical reality of the confession booth is entirely different. It is profoundly claustrophobic. It is dark, suffocating, and it reeks. I want you to try and imagine sitting in an unventilated wooden box for 4, sometimes 5 hours at a time on a Saturday afternoon. The air grows incredibly thick. You smell the stale, sour breath of the person on the other side of the screen, pressing their face against the wood. You smell cheap drugstore cologne, desperately trying to mask the stench of stale alcohol and cigarettes. You smell nervous, acidic sweat, unwashed bodies, and the distinct metallic odor of pure, unadulterated fear. You hear the heavy creak of the leather kneeler. You hear the wet, ragged breathing, and then the sharp slide of the wooden panel retracting. When I was ordained at 25, I was dangerously arrogant. I was full of righteous fire and absolute, unshakable certainty. I genuinely thought I was putting on spiritual armor. I believed that the stiff white collar made me a literal conduit for divine mercy. I thought I was going to pull broken people out of the mud and shepherd them toward the light. My parents wept with immense pride at my ordination. My seminary teachers praised my deep devotion. Society looked at me with immediate, entirely unearned respect. I was father. I was a moral pillar of the community. But the illusion shattered rapidly. Very quickly, the minor mundane sins, the petty workplace thefts, the harmless white lies, the teenager's predictable lust, faded into a monotonous background noise. Because intermixed with the ordinary complaints of everyday life were the actual monsters. And I learned a terrifying truth. The monsters are everywhere. They are not hiding in dark alleys. They are the people you buy your morning coffee from. They are the dedicated teachers at your children's elementary schools. They are your friendly neighbors. They are your family members. And I had to listen to them. I had to sit in that suffocating dark, bound tightly by the strictest, most unforgiving rule of my religion, the sacred seal of confession. It is an absolute, unbreakable vow of silence. If I broke it, I would be immediately excommunicated. My soul would be eternally damned to hell. I believe that deeply. I believe that the rules of the church were the literal, unbreakable laws of the universe. So I kept my mouth shut. I became a human garbage disposal for the sins of my parish. I absorbed their toxic waste, their hidden cruelty, their domestic violence, and their vile depravity. And in return, I was supposed to give them a clean slate. Ego te absolvo. I absolve you. I said those exact words tens of thousands of times. I traced the sign of the cross in the stifling, heavy air. At first, I foolishly thought I was healing them. But as the long years dragged on, a sickening realization settled deep into my bones. I wasn't healing anyone. I was actively enabling them. I was a silent accomplice, an accessory after the fact, hidden safely behind a piece of black cloth and a vow of silence that I cowardly valued more than human life. I need to tell you about a specific man. This is the exact memory that broke the first vital piece of my conscience. I was in my early 40s, assigned to a wealthy, influential parish in the suburbs. Our church had a highly prominent benefactor. I won't use his real name, but you know the exact type of man. He was a wildly successful local businessman. He bought the expensive new pipe organ for the choir. He funded the massive renovations for the youth center out of his own pocket. He sat proudly in the third row every single Sunday with his beautiful, well-dressed wife and his 3 perfectly groomed children. He was universally beloved. He was the kind of man people went to for business loans, for political advice, for major favors. He came into my booth on a Tuesday evening in November. It was pouring rain outside. I remember the heavy rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the massive stained glass windows above the nave. He slid onto the kneeler inside the booth. I knew his smooth, confident voice immediately. He didn't sound panicked. He didn't sound distraught or broken. He spoke in a calm, flat, entirely detached whisper, like he was reading off a grocery list or going over a quarterly financial report. Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. It has been 1 week since my last confession. He paused, clearing his throat quietly. Then he told me that 3 nights prior, driving home from a late celebratory dinner at his exclusive country club, he had been drinking heavily. He decided to take a shortcut through a poorly lit residential neighborhood to avoid the main roads. He said he looked down to change the radio station or adjust the heat. When he looked back up, he hit something solid. He felt the heavy, violent thud under the thick tires of his luxury sedan. He didn't stop. He panicked, he claimed. He hit the gas, drove straight to his secluded home, parked the car deep in his garage, and scrubbed the bumper clean with bleach himself. The next morning, the story was all over the local news channels. A 9-year-old boy, riding his bicycle home from a friend's house in the fading dusk, had been struck violently by a hit-and-run driver. The boy didn't die, but his spine was entirely severed. The news anchor reported he would never walk again. He would spend the rest of his natural life trapped in a wheelchair, drinking his meals through a plastic straw. His childhood and his future completely, violently erased by a bumper in the dark. I sat in the pitch-black booth. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to grip my knees. I could feel the blood rushing and roaring in my ears. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the man to break down sobbing, to tell me he was driving to the police station right after he left the church. Instead, he whispered, "I can't go to the authorities, Father. You have to understand. It would ruin my business empire. It would completely destroy my family's reputation. My wife couldn't handle the public scandal. I'll make a large anonymous financial donation to the family's medical GoFundMe. That's the most practical way to handle this. I am confessing it to God to clear my conscience so I can sleep." He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for a transaction. He was using the sacred sacrament of confession as a psychological reset button. And what did I do? Did I grab him by the throat through the wooden grate? Did I drag him out of the booth by his tailored suit and scream his name to the empty church? Did I call the police and demand justice for a crippled 9-year-old? No, I was a coward. I was entirely paralyzed by my vows. I gave him his pathetic penance, 10 Hail Marys, 5 Our Fathers. I spoke the mechanical words of absolution, ego te absolvo. The very next Sunday, I stood up at the marble altar. I held up the host, the body of Christ, and that same man walked up the center aisle, his hands folded piously. He looked me dead in the eyes, opened his mouth, and received communion. Then he walked calmly back to his pew, walking directly past the mother and father of the crippled boy who were sitting in the back row, weeping openly, begging God for strength to face their ruined lives. The man actually smiled at them. He nodded his head in feigned, polite sympathy. I watched him do it from the altar, and I knew in that exact sickening moment that my silence wasn't holy. My silence was purely evil. I was protecting a sociopath. I was standing squarely between justice and a monster, holding up a heavy shield made of ancient religious doctrine. If the hit and run fractured my soul, what happened 10 years later completely annihilated whatever was left of it. By my early 50s, I was functioning entirely on a numb, detached autopilot. I was drinking far too much cheap altar wine in the rectory at night just to force myself to sleep. I actively dreaded the confessional. I dreaded the harsh, grating slide of that wooden panel. I grew to deeply hate the people who came to me, burdened with their endless selfish filth. Then came the confession that finally broke my mind and spirit completely. It was a highly respected community leader, a man who sat on the city council, a man who actively shaped public policy, directed city funds, and decided the fates of thousands of people in our town. He came to my booth on a quiet Saturday afternoon in the dead of winter. The church was empty, filled with that heavy, golden, dust-filled late afternoon light. But inside the box, it was the same suffocating, oppressive darkness. He smelled strongly of expensive scotch and strong peppermint. He didn't even bother to start with the usual religious formula. He just started talking. He told me about a woman who worked directly under him in his political office. A young, vulnerable woman, fresh out of college, who looked up to him as a father figure and a professional mentor. He began an affair with her, but he made it very clear it wasn't just a physical affair. He detailed with chilling, methodical precision a sustained multi-year campaign of intense psychological torture. He intentionally isolated her from her friends and family. He convinced her she was losing her mind. He gaslit her relentlessly, hiding her personal belongings, denying that important conversations ever took place, humiliating her brutally in front of her colleagues, and then comforting her with fake affection behind closed doors. He broke her mind systematically, exactly the way a mechanic would dismantle an engine. Why? Because he enjoyed it. He freely admitted it to me in the dark. He liked the immense rush of power. He liked watching a bright, happy, capable human being slowly crumble into a paranoid, weeping, terrified shell of a person entirely under his complete control. 2 days before he stepped into my church, the young woman had driven her car to a secluded state park, swallowed an entire bottle of prescription sleeping pills, and died alone in the front seat. He sat on the other side of the screen. I could hear the expensive rustle of his wool suit jacket as he shifted his weight. His tone was not remotely remorseful. It was arrogant. It was the tone of a wealthy man recounting a slightly difficult, but ultimately victorious round of golf. "I suppose I might have pushed a little too hard at the very end, Father," he said casually. "Things got a bit out of hand. She was always far too fragile for the political world. But I need absolution today so I can move on with a clear head. I have a major re-election campaign starting next month, and I can't afford distractions." He was bragging. He was sitting in the supposed house of God, entirely secure in the absolute, ironclad protection of the church's ancient laws, and he was boasting to me about a murder he committed without ever leaving a single physical fingerprint. He knew I could do absolutely nothing. He knew I was spiritually chained to the floor. He was intentionally flaunting his immunity directly in my face. I couldn't speak. My throat seized up as if an invisible hand was choking me. My stomach violently and suddenly rebelled. I threw open the heavy door of the confessional, stumbling out into the light, and sprinted frantically down the side aisle into the private sacristy. I collapsed heavily over the small marble sink where we washed the sacred chalices, and I violently vomited. I retched and heaved until there was nothing left in my stomach but burning acid, until my ribs ached fiercely and my vision blurred with tears of pure hatred. I stayed curled on that freezing cold stone floor for over an hour. I realized then, with absolute clarity, that my faith was completely, irreversibly dead. God wasn't in that wooden box. God wasn't anywhere in that massive stone building. There were just 2 men sitting in the dark. One was a sadistic, calculating monster who destroyed a human life for sport, and the other was a pathetic, terrified coward hiding behind a stiff white collar, vastly more afraid of breaking a man-made rule than of standing up to pure, unadulterated evil. I was an active, willing accomplice. My rigid silence was the exact weapon they relied on to get away with their atrocities. I left the priesthood shortly after that. I was 65 years old. I claimed failing health to the bishop, packed a single suitcase, and walked away. But it was too late. It was decades too late. I should have walked out the very day the man in the luxury sedan confessed to paralyzing that little boy. I should have marched to the police precinct in my vestments, But I didn't. I stayed in the dark. I kept their horrific secrets. I willingly swallowed their poison day after day until it completely, thoroughly hollowed me out from the inside. Now, I am 83. I am completely and utterly alone. I have no wife to comfort me. I have no children to visit me. I have no lasting legacy in this world, except a massive, invisible, crushing mountain of horrifying secrets that I am going to take directly to the grave. I sit in this cheap chair, waiting for death in this sterile apartment, and I am deeply terrified of it, because I know exactly what I am, and I know exactly what I have done. I know exactly what you are thinking right now. You are sitting there listening to a bitter old man, and you are judging me. You are shaking your head thinking, I would never do that. I would have gone to the police. I would have been brave. I would have spoken up and stopped them. Don't you dare lie to yourself. Don't you dare sit there and act like you are morally superior. You do the exact same thing every single day of your life, just on a slightly smaller scale. You constantly look the other way. You know your boss is embezzling money or sexually harassing the new hire, and you stay absolutely quiet because you need the promotion and the paycheck. You know your best friend is drinking himself to death and hitting his wife behind closed doors, but you don't want to cause an awkward scene at the weekend barbecue. You see cruelty, you see injustice, you see people being destroyed right in front of your eyes, and you expertly justify your silence because intervening is inconvenient or risky or against the unspoken rules of polite society. You protect your own comfort just like I fiercely protected my holy vows. You hide safely behind your mortgage, your career trajectory, your carefully curated social standing. I hid behind the sprawling institution of the church. We are exactly the same. The only difference between us is that I am completely out of time to pretend otherwise. I am standing at the very end of my life, looking back at a vast, barren wasteland of missed opportunities to simply do the right thing. I traded my living soul to keep a promise to an institution that cared vastly more about preserving its own ancient laws than protecting the actual lives of the people it claimed to serve. Do not make the same fatal mistake. Do not let rules or fear or the desperate desire to fit in override your basic human duty to protect the innocent. When you see a monster, point right at it. Scream at the top of your lungs. Break the rules. Shatter the silence. Because if you don't, I promise you, the silence will eventually devour you alive. It will eat your conscience. It will eat your courage. And one day you will wake up as a frail old person in a quiet, lonely room, realizing with absolute horror that by rigidly keeping your mouth shut, you willingly forfeited your humanity. There is no absolution for that. I know. I spent 40 years of my life handing it out to monsters, and I have absolutely none left for myself.